Good morning. My name's Raphael. I'm from a group called North London Ulysses, and we meet weekly and we read Ulysses in the pub. And I complement that by videos in which I provide an extract of the reading and also give some commentary and some thoughts. And today I have the unenviable task of giving my thoughts on the first 15 pages or so of a chapter called Scylla Charybdis. There aren't really chapters in the book, but it sort of breaks into 18 natural segments. Normally, my commentaries are a bit of an overview, but I thought this is such a dense and difficult chapter that it warranted further, more detailed analysis, really. And I've set myself up to do this. I'm not an academic. I'm just an ordinary bloke that has read the book quite a lot now. I've been doing this for about 5 years, reading Ulysses in pubs. I've coached lots and lots of people through the book, so I like to think that I've gained some sort of insight to it. If not, I've been wasting my time somewhat, and lots of other people's. I'm also I'm thinking of making this video wider available, not just to my little group, just to sort of put myself out there a bit and see if others out there like what's going on and might want to join me. So, Scylla Charybdis. I've already given the Homeric background to this in the video in which I did my reading. I read. So we tend to work from the Penguin because it's got quite large print, so it's quite good for the pub. We're dealing with pages 235 to 252. If you're familiar with the chapter in the National Library, pretty much from the beginning of the chapter to where Mulligan makes his entrance, that's the period that what we're talking about. More or less half of the chapter, not quite, but getting there. So I'm not going to repeat the full Homeric background. Essentially, it's about the choice between the hard cliff on one side as the boat is sailing through, in which the monster Scylla lives and will almost definitely reach down and kill 6 people with her 6 heads, and on the other side a whirlpool, which you might be lucky enough to get through unscathed, but if you're not and it gets you, it's going to kill everyone. It's going to suck everyone down. So there's lots of choices. A sort of rock and a hard place type idea, which is likened to Aristotle and Plato. And people get very scared of that. They think, oh my God, I don't know much about philosophy. I'm not getting involved in that. They get completely put off. You don't need to know that much. I think it'll just bear in mind that Plato's world of ideas corresponds to the whirlpool with little structure on which to hold this dreamy, free-flowing whirlpool of ideas where time and space may not even exist. And contrasting that with Aristotle, who was Plato's student, and said, yes, I get that, and I agree, but it's not really acceptable. We need a structure to get through the day, never mind life. And Aristotle provided this, many definitions, many theses, and what have you, and more sort of something a bit more rigid to hold on to. What else? We're in the National Library. Stephen is explaining to some real literary high flyers in Dublin his theory on Shakespeare. We heard a little bit about that in chapter 1, didn't we? Telemachus. And now he's going to see if he can show off to these people, and he's going to essentially try and convince the bigwigs of literary Ireland that Shakespeare moved from Plato to Aristotle in that he used real life experiences and featured those in his plays, and the plays actually reflect Shakespeare's life in many ways. He didn't just dream them up out of nothing. And we'll bear that in mind for Stephen Dedalus' own literary endeavours, and for Stephen Reed. We take the liberty of reading James Joyce, who goes on to write this book and uses lots of experiences for that. And, so Stephen's growing maturity to get there. And we can contrast that with Bloom, as we'll go through in our discussion. So I'm very well prepared. I've spent 10 minutes reading the complete works of Shakespeare, another 15 minutes reading Plato and Aristotle and Schopenhauer. I'm armed with my annotated notes, my Gifford and Seidman annotated notes. And dare I also give myself a little plug. There's my book, An Understanding of Ulysses, Normal Joyce for Normal People. In lockdown, I gave a series of lectures on the book, and I've put them in there. Okay, so without further ado, we'll get going. So in the Penguin, we're on page 235. It begins, Urbane to comfort them. I suppose I ought to say just very quickly, there are so many Shakespearean references in this. I'm not going to point out all of them. Sometimes it's every other word. I think I will where I feel that it's advances the plot or adds to our understanding. But where it's sort of there for its own sake, I'll just leave them be. Okay, so we start off. We're in mid-sentence. We're in the Quaker librarian, who is described as urbane, and that's significant. Our first word of the book, stately, gave some character insight into Buck Mulligan. You may recall, that he was a bit of an actor, a bit of a joker. And so here the librarian is described as urbane, and he is to comfort them, and that is his personality. He's a chap called William Lister. He was the head librarian of the National Library of Ireland, so really quite a senior literary position. And there he is in the room, and he's there with another chap, his assistant librarian, a guy called William McGee, who went under a pen name. He was an essayist. He wrote under the pen name of John Eglinton, and he'll be referred to in this by that as well, and sometimes as McGee Eglinton. And there is a third chap there that we'll come to shortly. And I think the fact that we have our librarian Lister described as a Quaker, that he's comforting them, that he's purring, he's a gentle sort of guy and a decent guy, a Quaker. I think in a Catholic city, most of the senior positions in 1904 are still held by non-Catholics of one degree or another. I think that's fair to say. And this chap is a Quaker. So mid-sentence, and the discussion about Hamlet is already going on. And he says, we've got those priceless pages of Wilhelm Meister. Wilhelm Meister was a book or a play, was it, by Goethe, about this chap, Wilhelm Meister, who himself wrote a play on Shakespeare, so almost immediately establishing Shakespeare as an international playwright. He's well known in Germany. Will go on to France, so really setting him up as even hundreds of years ago, he was really regarded as pretty much the top playwright. And here is Goethe writing about Shakespeare, a great poet on a great brother poet. And what does he write about? A hesitating soul taking arms against a sea of troubles, torn by conflicting doubts, as one sees in real life. Almost summing up, so Goethe summing up Hamlet and Lister summing up them both, saying that heavy responsibility was thrust upon Hamlet way too young. And he couldn't cope with the weight of that responsibility. A hesitating soul taking arms against a sea of troubles, liking that to the Straits of Messina, where Odysseus's fleet now are. They're in a sea of troubles, sailing too close to Scylla on one side or Charybdis on the other side. You don't send a boy to do a man's job, but King Hamlet, the ghost that has been killed, comes back to his son as a ghost and says, List, listen to me. I need you to exact revenge on my brother who killed me and your mother who goaded him on to doing it, because they are having sex. And not only have they killed me, they've taken my kingdom. So the new king and queen of Denmark has usurped my position and your birthright, my son, Hamlet. But Hamlet is age 22, right? The age that Stephen is now. So that's that first bit. And then he comes forward a syncopace and then backwards a syncopace. And then a bit further down, he corantoed out. So little dances he's doing, I think from Twelfth Night or somewhere, and because he wants to be in the room, in the conversation. They're sort of in an ante-room off of the main reading room in the National Library of Ireland. He wants to be involved in this conversation, but a noiseless attendant has beckoned him. He's needed outside, and he's a very diligent man, so he's half in and half going out. He says to the attendant directly, creaking to go. He's on creaking floorboards, and he's in these leather brogues that are sort of creaking as well, but he's lingering. Yes, the beautiful, ineffectual dreamer who comes to grief against hard facts. We can almost see the dreamy whirlpool against the hard cliff of Scylla. And then he corantoed off, bawled, most zealous by the door. He gave his large ear all to the attendant's words, heard them, and was gone. Then we have the words two left. That's Stephen's interior monologue, and he thinks, right, I've now got an audience of two. I'm halfway through giving my trying to convince them. And what's Stephen trying to convince them of? He's talking about his theory on Hamlet. And I'll remind you, if we go back to page 21, Mulligan. Now, we know we can't trust Mulligan, but what Mulligan says is that his theory, it's quite simple. He proves by algebra that Hamlet's son is Shakespeare's grandfather and that he himself is the ghost of his own father. So ridiculously complicated and nonsensical, and it's Mulligan describing that in his pithy way to Haynes, but we assume that is the sort of the gist of it, that Shakespeare is both a son and a father somehow, and that Stephen is somehow his own son and his own father, or comparable to that in some way. Okay, we'll get into it. But what is Stephen really doing there? He's there with the head librarian, the assistant librarian, another chap called George Russell, a very, very well-respected intellectual man of letters, and another assistant librarian that will be in shortly. And he's really convincing. He's trying to convince them how clever he is as a 22-year-old. He is worthy of their company. That is what is really going on here, I think. So we're about halfway we've done a few lines. We're halfway down page 235. And then, actually, something's just come into my head. I think I described the chief librarian as William Lister. It's Thomas William Lister. So, yes, Thomas Lister. Let's give him his right name. Then we come on to a line. Monsieur de Palisse, Stephen sneered, was alive 15 minutes before his death. What a strange line. What on earth is that about? Well, I actually think it's one of the most important lines in the entire episode of Scylla and Charybdis. And what it's about, de la Palisse was a French military general, I assume, a high-ranking officer who led his troops into a futile battle in 15-something or other. And the troops said of him that he was alive just before he died. And so Stephen, first of all, the first words that Stephen utters here in this chapter is Monsieur de la Palisse, and he doesn't so much utter them as sneer them. Okay, and what is he commenting on? He's commenting on this nice Quaker librarian's comment that Hamlet was a hesitating soul taking arms against a sea of trouble, torn by conflicting doubts as one sees in real life. And this phrase, the reference to Monsieur de Palisse was alive 15 minutes before he was dead, is really saying, well, someone's stating the obvious. And not only that, Stephen is sneering it. And he's sneering it about the head librarian, and not even to his face. He's left the room. So this is really pretty impolite on Stephen's part and displaying a lot of arrogance. And here he is. He's 22 years old, shabbily dressed, barely slept the previous night in the Martello Tower. And he's up against these people, and he's just really insulted these people's boss. Well, one person's boss. And throughout the rest of the chapter, John Eglinton, or William K. McGee, the assistant librarian, will be pretty nasty to Stephen, and we really take against him. He's sort of the villain of the chapter, if you like. But one can understand why, in a sense. You know, this is Joyce really sets this scene. It's the first thing that Stephen says, and he's really rude and arrogant as a 22-year-old know-nothing who thinks he knows everything. So in that line and a half, Joyce has really created a massive amount of important background for us. So Eglinton then comes back at him. Have you found those 6 brave medicals? With elders gall, he has gall, to write Paradise Lost at your dictation. The Sorrows of Satan, he calls them. There's a lot in there. Gifford seems to have dredged up from somewhere that Stephen was in the midst of writing or planning to write. People, the literary circles of Dublin, have heard that he is planning to rewrite Paradise Lost with Satan as the hero. Maybe, I'm assuming it was somewhere in a portrait of the artist that mentions this, because Gifford simply references it without saying where that reference is from. At your dictation, I assume reference to the fact that blind Milton, had to dictate Paradise Lost. And the Sorrows of Satan, he calls it. So that's a dig, because the Sorrows of Satan, if I turn to Gifford, I'll remind myself who wrote it. Was it a Maria someone? Anyway, it wasn't a great... Yes, Maria Corelli, pseudonym of Mary Mackay. Right. She was notable for her outspoken prejudice that her critics were all blasphemers, and for the fact that she regarded herself as a latter-day Shakespeare, according to Gifford. And The Sorrows of Satan was something she wrote, and it's slightly more down market. So I think, generally speaking, Eglinton is having a go at Stephen. Stephen thinks, smile, smile, Cranley's smile. First he tickled her, then he passed her, then he passed the female catheter, for he was a medical, jolly old medic. This is an extract from a poem written by Oliver St. John Gogarty, aka Buck Mulligan, and called Medical Dick and Medical Davy. It's very blasphemous, pretty rude. And he thinks of Cranley. So we need to take notice whenever Cranley is mentioned. This is in a portrait. Cranley was his main confidant at university, and obviously Cranley used to smile when he wasn't necessarily being sincere. And I'm assuming they spoke of that poem between he and Cranley. Right. Eglinton goes on, but you would need more than 6. You would need one more for Hamlet, because and 7 is clear to the mystic mind. The shining 7, W.B. Yeats. The shining 7 will be the planets. So you'll need 7 to write if you're rewriting Hamlet. And again, an allusion to the arrogance of this 22-year-old. He's rewriting Paradise Lost. He wants to lecture us about us, the literary experts of Ireland. He wants to lecture us on Hamlet. The next paragraph, I think, is narration. Glitter-eyed. Why are his eyes glittery? Because they're in a fairly darkened room with desk lamps on the table. We'll go to description of the room a bit later. And so the light from the desk lamps, as sort of through the opacity of these green, I take them to be green sort of shades, is reflecting in his glasses. His rufous skull, red head, close to his green-capped desk lamp, salt the face, bearded and dark green a shadow, and olive holy-eyed. Very interesting. So Eglinton thinks he's made a joke. And the key word there, I think, is salt. He salt the face. He makes a joke and he looks at someone else seeking their face in deeper shadow. He wants validation of his joke, doesn't he? So this is giving a bit of character background to Eglinton. He's a little unsure of himself. He laughed low, a sizer's laugh of Trinity, i.e. a student's laugh, but it goes unanswered. So he seeks validation from the other person, his companion in the room, who is described as an Olav, holy-eyed and bearded, but it goes unanswered. Orchestral Satan, weeping many a roe, tears as such as angels weep. I'm assuming this is from Paradise Lost, until we get to the last line, ed egli avea del calfatto trombetta. This is Dante's Inferno, and there's a true, I can't think of the precise circumstances of it, but I know that it means bend over and make of your backside a trumpet. So, you know, completely outrageous, and Stephen sort of laughing inwardly at this Eglinton, that he didn't get the validation that he needed. He holds my follies hostage. He's worked out that Eglinton is going to be his enemy in this debate. And on we go. dense, isn't it? We've done a page and a half so far, although I think we can begin to move a little faster. He holds my follies hostage. Then, as Cranley's in his mind, Stephen thinks about that Cranley has told him that, to free Ireland of the British, one assumes, just give him 11 true Wicklow men. Cranley was from the county Wicklow, and one assumes he'll need 12 because Cranley would be the 12th. Gaptooth Kathleen, reference to W.B. Yeats' play Kathleen the Houlihan, and her 4 beautiful green fields, i.e. the 4 kingdoms of Ireland. The stranger in her house was the British. And one more to hail him, so this is Cranley himself, would make up the 12th. And then Stephen thinks of the Last Supper. One more to hail him. How did the Romans know when they stormed the Last Supper to arrest Jesus? How did they know which one was Jesus? And because they find out because Judas goes up to Jesus and says, Ave Rabbi. Hello, Rabbi. Jesus was their teacher, as a signal to the Romans to say, this is the guy to arrest. The Tinnahaley 12. Cranley was from Tinnahaley, and whether we make is Cranley considered to be a bit of a Judas figure? He was his great friend, but he sort of lets him down at the end. In the Shadow of the Glen, John Millington Synge play, the Cooeys. Right, my soul's youth I gave him. I think he's thinking about his friendship with Cranley. That makes him think about that Mulligan has my telegram. We'll learn about this telegram, but that we go from Cranley to Mulligan, I think, holds some significance to Stephen, that he's gone from one figure in which he placed too much trust, perhaps, to another in Mulligan. Folly persist. Is this his folly in continuing with is he persisting with the Shakespeare theory, or is he thinking about Mulligan, and should he persist with the friendship or not? Then the next paragraph. Our young Irish bards, John Eglinton censured, have yet to create a figure which the world will set beside Saxon Shakespeare's Hamlet. So he acknowledges as an Irishman that Shakespeare is the greatest playwright of all. Certainly there's no Irish equivalent of that. And that Hamlet may well be his greatest character. And even though it's considered idolatry, that side of the Irish Sea, to recognise this in an Englishman, it is surely churlish not to do so. As old Ben did, I'm assuming Ben Jonson. Now we get to the nub of things, or we begin to. This other character in the room pipes up, and it turns out to be George Russell, bearded Olav Holyeyed. We met George Russell, didn't we, in Lestrygonians. Bloom is overtaken by him walking with a bicycle alongside a woman whose stockings have fallen slightly, and we have Bloom's amusing thoughts on that. We know George Russell is the leading proponent of theosophy, and we've touched on that before. We will do again shortly. So described as Olav Holyeyed is perhaps because of his theosophical credentials. And what Russell says is, these questions are purely academic. We don't really care about his life. Art has to reveal to us ideas, formless, spiritual essences. The supreme question about a work of art is, out of how deep a life does it spring? The paintings of Moreau, the poetry of Shelley, The words of Hamlet bring our mind into contact with the eternal wisdom. Plato's world of ideas, all the rest is the speculation of schoolboys for schoolboys. So he's really letting Stephen know where he stands. If Stephen has been trying to make the case for Shakespeare's real life experiences being grist to the mill of his storytelling, Russell isn't buying it. He thinks that art is about ideas. He is on the Platonic side, the whirlpool, the dreamy whirlpool of Charybdis. And art comes from your soul. You don't have to observe outside experiences and take those secondhand to create art. It's about you and your ideas. And that's where he stands. Okay. The line at the top of 237, AE has been telling some Yankee interviewer, well, that's referenced back in Aeolus. J.J. O'Malloy comes up to Stephen and said, someone was telling me about you. Apparently you woke up a George Russell in the middle of the night. AE, you remember George Russell is known as AE. Why he's known as that we might think of in a moment. So he wrote under a pseudonym AE, but his name's George Russell, and that reflecting a real life incident where Joyce goes and speaks with AE, and an American was over and interviewed George Russell, and this was recalled. Stephen retorts to George Russell, well, the schoolmen were schoolboys first. And he says this super politely. So he clearly regards George Russell as in a different league to others that he's spoken to. And he says it super politely. Aristotle was once Plato's schoolboy, but John Eglinton puts him down and has remained so, one should hope. One can see him as a model schoolboy with a diploma under his arm. He laughed again at the now smiling, bearded face. You remember before Eglinton sought the reassurance, the validating reassurance of George Russell, and he didn't get a smile. Now at least, or a laugh. Now at least he's got a smile. Now we're into Stephen's interior monologue, and he's thinking about George Russell and theosophy. So theosophy, we've mentioned it briefly, but it was very much in vogue in 1904 Europe, and Ireland was not immune from it. The leading proponent was Madame Helena Blavatsky, Petrovna Blavatsky, and she, I think, was based in London. And it was a sort of form of Christianity, but it combined essences of Eastern religion and Eastern mysticism, a bit of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, if I'm not mistaken, but sort of Buddhism with Christianity overladen on it. I think obviously that's a very rough summary, and I'm no expert in these things. But that's broadly where we are. And then the next 3 paragraphs on page 237 are really about theosophy and both a bit of the philosophy behind it and a bit about the people involved in it and the politics involved in it. And perhaps to Joyce, the politics may have been more interesting than the philosophy itself. I think Joyce flirted with it and then sort of decided it wasn't for him. So George Russell has been talking about uh, formless spiritual essences, that this is what art is about. And he thinks about him in those terms: formless, spiritual, Father, Word, and Holy Breath, sort of their equivalent of the Holy Trinity, because it was sort of Buddhism grafted onto Christianity in a sense. All Father, the heavenly man, Jesus Christos, Jesus Christ, magician of the beautiful, the Logos. The Logos is sort of thoughts handed down from the deity or from God. This verily is that. I am the fire upon the altar. I am the sacrificial butter. Just coming out with sort of theosophist sayings and things. But of course, Joyce very much thought he was the fire upon the altar. And you may have there was a phrase in Aeolus, wasn't there, where Miles Crawford says, I think to J.J. O'Malloy, perhaps, we're the sacrifice. You know, we've got about as much of a chance of a bit of butter in hell or something like that, or in the furnace, meaning we the Irish. So maybe there's something about that, or that Joyce put upon himself that he was the sacrificial thing. So having spoken a bit about how theosophists speak or conduct their meetings, we then get into the people of it. Dunlop, a judge. These are two people. The noblest Roman of them all, A.E., i.e. George Russell. And what was interesting about to Joyce, I think, about the Theosophists were how much they argued with each other, and how I think they ended up in court suing each other about who had the rights to be to hold the meeting. I don't know what the litigation was about, but there was quite a bit of infighting among them. The Arval was their sort of their meetings, I think. The name ineffable, so a bit like in Judaism and Islam, where you can't, it was idolatry, you can't name God. So Yahweh becomes Jehovah, is just sort of an acronym for not saying the word of God. And similarly, I think with Islam and the Prophet, with Muhammad. And so in heaven, so KH, and Gifford says who this is, the name ineffable, not to be uttered. Master KH was Kut Humi, one of Blavatsky's two masters. He was a Tibetan who had evolved to a superhuman level, according to Gifford. And he, after he died, communicated with Blavatsky, supposedly, whose identity is no secret to the adepts. The Christ with the bride's sister, that will be Sophia, I'm assuming, born of an ensouled virgin. So it's just giving a flavour of theosophy. The life esoteric is not for ordinary person. OP must work off bad karma. So OP and ordinary people. Not everyone can get it. Mrs. Cooper Oakley, she was one of the main driving forces behind it. I think, I'm assuming in London, once glimpsed our very illustrious sister's elemental. And who is the illustrious sister? Helena Petrovna. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's elemental. So the elemental, I think in terms of chakras, or part of you is visible, but most of you, most of your elements are invisible. But this Mrs. Cooper Oakley once saw part of Blavatsky's elemental, and then this line about, oh bloody hell, the devil, Pew Teufel, you're not to look, missus, so you're not, and when a lady's a showing of her elemental. So this is all interior monologue for going on inside Stephen's head, just as he's observing George Russell and listening to what he's saying. Right. We then get a new character. Dr. Richard Best. He had become the assistant librarian in 1904 and would remain so, I think, until around 1923, when he would take over as top dog. So whereas John Eglinton or William K. Magee remained the assistant librarian until retiring, and I think going off to England. So Best, an Ulsterman, takes over from Lister, I assume from Lister, and becomes sort of the boss of the whole thing. But for now, so he's a younger man, I think fair-haired man, and quite handsome, according to the way the chapter will progress. But in he comes. He enters, tall, young, mild, light. He bore in his hand with grace a notebook, new, large, clean, bright. Stephen continues about schoolboys, because Eglinton has said, yes, and I would hope that Aristotle would remain a schoolboy compared to Plato. One can see him with his the model schoolboy with the diploma under his arm. Stephen continues, that model schoolboy would find Hamlet's musings about the afterlife, i.e. in his speech To Be or Not to Be, the afterlife of his princely soul, the improbable, insignificant, and undramatic monologue, as shallow as Plato's. I won't go into the weeds there. We could get stuck forever in terms of Plato and Aristotle's views of the afterlife. They both believed in the afterlife. But then Eglinton, frowning, waxing wroth. Upon my word, it makes my blood boil to hear anyone compare Aristotle with Plato. So Eglinton, at this point, seems to be very much in the Platonic camp, whether it's to side with George Russell against Stephen. Stephen seems to be implying that perhaps the Aristotelian view is a better one to understand Hamlet and indeed all of Shakespeare's plays. Now, whether these are genuinely held position by Eglinton or Eglinton's just doesn't like Stephen and he's just taking a contrary position, we'll just consider as we go through. And Stephen comes back. Well, which of the two, Stephen asks, would have banished me from his commonwealth? So is it in Plato's Republic? And he considers poets and poets that are derivative. There will be no place for any sort of derivative poet in the Republic. So is Stephen making that sort of suggestion? He then thinks to himself, unsheath your dagger definitions. Horseness is the whatness of all horse. And then, gosh, this is quite a tricky paragraph, isn't it? Streams of tendency and aeons they worship. God, noise in the street, very peripatetic. Space, what you damn well have to see. Through spaces smaller than red globules of man's blood, they creepy crawl after Blake's buttocks into eternity, of which this vegetable world is but a shadow. Hold to the now, the here, through which all future plunges to the past. Goodness me, we could spend all day on that, and I'm probably not going to make a great job of it, but I'll do my best. Unsheathe your dagger definitions. Okay, this is putting him in Aristotle's camp. I mentioned briefly at the outset that Aristotle created lots of definitions. He generally agreed with Plato. He didn't disagree with him that arguably there is no time and space, therefore we are all just within this huge void. You know, there is simply ideas. And I think this has become sort of the basis of Western philosophy, and certainly Schopenhauer And we primed ourselves in chapter 3 with a bit of Schopenhauer, with a bit of Bishop Berkeley, a bit of transcendental idealism, I think is the lingo, where we simply trust our five senses to indicate to us what reality, the world without, might be, but actually we don't know. Our senses are all we've got. They might be fallible. But Aristotle comes along and says, yes, fine, I get it, but we've got to get through the day somehow. And I'm going to define and organize and structurize, and we'll have something to hang on to because it's just unacceptable otherwise. So Stephen is going to unsheath those dagger definitions. That's what he will fight with. The horseness is the whatness of all horse. So here we are back to Plato. There is a horse. It was the Grand National over the weekend in England. So there were lots of horses and we could watch them. But once they're gone, would we be able to describe them? Would we be able to describe that particular horse? Well, not necessarily. We'd be left with the idea of a horse. It isn't necessarily that one. Once that horse is dead, we still have a representation in our heads of a horse. It's horseness. And it's sort of an image of all horses that ever were combined. It's the idea of a horse. Streams and tendency and aeons, they worship. Who is the they? Is that Aristotle and Plato, or is that the Theosophists? The aeons are these thoughts handed down from God. In my head, I don't know if I've got this right, George Russell, where does the AE come from? Bloom wondered if it was Albert Edward and all sorts of other possibilities, but I think it might have been he wanted his pseudonym to be Aeon, but there was a misprint and they missed off the N, and it was just came out as AE, and he thought, oh, all right then, well, that was obviously meant to be a bit of synchronicity, so he stuck with the AE. I might be wrong, but I think that might be it. What does Plato and Aristotle, what do they think of God? God is simply a noise in the street. Very peripatetic. So back in Nestor, history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. Then he hears the kids playing hockey, equivalenting to perhaps the battles of World War One. And someone scores a goal and there's a shout, and Stephen says in response to Nestor's linear view of the way to heaven and to God, he said, well, that's God. And Nestor says, what? And he says, a shout in the street. And so it's a noise in the street, very peripatetic, because the way of teaching, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, they would talk as they walked. Oral tradition. Space, what you damn well have to see. Moving to Aristotle, you can't, and to the ineluctable modality of the visible. Aristotle said, there's the stars in the sky. They are in a particular pattern. That's giving us lessons. And now through spaces smaller than red globules of man's blood, they creepy crawly after Blake's buttocks. So I think we've got Blake going on here, mixed in with. Right, Blake wrote a poem called Milton, quite a long poem, in which he imagines that Milton has come back and entered Blake. The soul of Milton has re-entered the body of Blake through his heel. Here perhaps there's a reference that it might have been through his bottom, but it's through his heel. And then through spaces smaller than, and Blake's idea was that, or was it Milton's idea, or perhaps a combination, was that anything bigger than a globule of blood was something, and everything smaller was a portal to a, a, a deeper reality that is not visible to us, perhaps similar to Schopenhauer's noumena, the underlying reality that is beyond our comprehension, through which the world is but a shadow. Now, the business about crawls after Blake's buttocks, is this a combination with Dante's Inferno, where Dante and Virgil escape hell by crawling across Satan's buttocks up his thigh and then heads out into the sunlight? Satan is powerless to do anything because he's frozen, encased in ice. And of course, at this very moment, well, I'm guessing at a similar moment, is Bloom not staring up at the buttocks of the statue of Venus for reasons that we rather amusingly discussed back in Lestrygonians? Hold to the now, the here, through which all future plunges to the past. We'll think about this in terms of how one thinks of history, and now one thinks of history through the now, and then in the future the now will be the past. We'll think more on that shortly. Yes, apparently it's a bit of St. Augustine, and I will turn to Gifford for some help, and what Gifford says now about hold to the now, after St. Augustine's on the immortality of the soul. For what is done needs expectation that it may be done, and memory that it may be understood as much as possible. And expectation is of future things, and memory is of things past. But the intention to act is of the present, through which the future flows into the past. Oh, goodness me. Okay. Right. Let's move into slightly easier waters. I think the next few pages you'll be relieved to know I think we can do that. So Richard Best came forward and he says, Haynes is gone. Oh, someone says, oh, is he? Yes, I was showing him Jubainville's book. He's quite enthusiastic about Hyde's Love Songs of Connacht, and he's gone off to buy it. And then we get a little snippet of Douglas Hyde. I don't know if it's from Love Songs of Connacht or something else, but that's his. That's a bit of his poetry, and we've come across him before, and Stephen rather uncharitably thought about his poetry back in Aeolus, about mouth-to-mouth kiss, and he wasn't very, compared to Dante's poetry, he didn't think much of Douglas Hyde's, or at least not that particular poem. So Haynes. We know Haynes from chapter 1. We know that he's an Englishman from Oxford University, but very passionate about Ireland and things Irish, and has come here to learn as much as he can and produce and gather quaint Irish sayings that he wants to put in a book. And now that he's heard about Douglas Hyde's Love Songs of Connacht, he wants to go and buy it. So he's missing this discussion about Hamlet, and he's choosing to do that instead. John Eglinton opines, the peat smoke is going to his head. So quite an astute observation. He's rather overcome with anything sentimentally Irish. And Eglinton describes that as peat smoke. And then we get into some interior monologue with Stephen, remembering about his conversation with Haynes this morning. We feel in England, he went on to say, that we in England, we feel we've treated you Irish rather badly. But of course, it's not our fault. History is to blame. Stephen thinks of him as penitent thief gone. I smoked his baccy. Haynes offers Stephen a cigarette, which he took. He offered it out of his silver cigarette case, which had a green emerald in the corner. An emerald set in the ring of the sea, with the implications of that. Right, George Russell says something else, and he comments on these love songs. And he says, people don't know how dangerous love songs can be. The auric egg of Russell warned occultly. The movements which were revolutions in the world are born out of the dreams and visions in a peasant's heart on the hillside. For them, the earth is not an exploitable ground, but the living mother. So true revolution needs to come from simple folk for whom the land is their means of earning a living. It's not, so it's sort of an anti-colonial statement, really. It's not, the land does not represent other people coming in and taking it and using it for their resource and their exploitation. True revolution comes from the peasants who live off of the land. And so we should pay attention to the poetry of Douglas Hyde, the love songs of Connacht, who I think is writing in that sort of ilk. And Russell concludes by likening these simple folk to the life of Homer's Phaeacians, who, if I'm not mistaken, were the gentle folk that finally, in the Nausicaa book of the Odyssey, agree to take Odysseus back to Ithaca. From these words, Mr. Best turned an unoffending face to Stephen, and then he says, but now I'm joining in the chapter, now I'm joining in this discussion on Hamlet. Mallarmé has written those wonderful prose poems about Hamlet. And just as we started off hearing about Goethe's German view of of Hamlet, so now we get the French view. And he says, and it's Hamlet set in a French provincial town. And it was called Hamlet or Distracted, a piece by Shakespeare, or a piece of Shakespeare. And Distracted, Stephen thinks of The Absent-Minded Beggar, the poem by Kipling. So Hamlet the Distracted, again going back to this, don't send a boy to do a man's job. He was, just this young prince, and now he's got all of these responsibilities with which he can't cope. The Absent-Minded Beggar, poem by Kipling, because Shakespeare was distracted and absent-minded. Because Hamlet was distracted and absent-minded, so Stephen thinks absent-minded, or says Absent-Minded Beggar, a popular poem at that time, which we'll get to shortly. But Eglinton says, yes, I suppose it would be. The French are excellent people, but distressingly short-sighted in some matters. I'm not sure what they were short-sighted about. I've heard perhaps it's because they got rid of the aristocracy during the Revolution. Maybe that's it. So, okay.
Hi, this is Editorial Russell, just jumping in here. I've decided to split this commentary into two because it was getting very long and unwieldy and probably too much to deal with in one bite. So I'll pause there. We're on towards the bottom of page 239, and I will start there in the next video through to the end. Thanks very much. So as I'm ending this video here, in case you don't listen to the other one and you're not in my group, let me just say that this is part of North London Ulysses. If you'd like to join us, you can either come down to the pub, contact me, I'll give you the details. We meet weekly. But if you're not in North London or that isn't convenient, then patreon.com/North London Ulysses. There is also a North London Ulysses Facebook page. And through that, you can watch all of the videos. It's a tiny paywall, about $6 a month. And then you can get all of the videos and catch up and then join us, or just deal with it at your own pace if you've enjoyed this sort of detail. They're not all this sort of detail, I have to say, but hopefully enough for you in your private reading to help you through. So thanks very much, and goodbye.